Hey everybody, it's Scott. I'm taking the time to do another tutorial. This time though, I'm diverging from my normal path of just Ember focused tutorials, and I'm going to do my first React tutorial, and specifically an introduction to React components, and basically React using create React app. So as a couple caveats, this is a very intro kind of tutorial, making the assumption that you've never even seen a React app before. But I am making the assumption that you at least have some skill with JavaScript and some experience with HTML, CSS. So if you're new to those things, maybe this isn't the best jumping off point. Or if you have worked in a React app, we're really going to just be covering the basics, so maybe this isn't the video for you. So as just a quick overview of what we're going to do, we're going to use create React app to create a React app. This gives us a nice out-of-the-box implementation of a standard React app. It takes care of the Webpack configuration for us. That's something that trips up a lot of people, or they burn a lot of time on. This is just a great way to get an app up and running with a very standard implementation so we can start building things immediately. Along those lines, this video is just going to focus on that out-of-the-box implementation. We're not going to be pulling in any other NPM packages. We're really just focusing on what do we get out of the box with React. So let's copy this command from the create React website. So it uses npx to install create React app and then generate a new app. So this npx is going to get the latest version of whatever npm package you're specifying and then run that command. So let's copy that, but we'll call it intro app. And this might take a couple of minutes, so I'll probably just jump forward. Awesome, so once that's finished, we will have a new intro app repository. So I'm going to open this up in addons so we can take a look at what it created for us. So if we look here, we look in our package JSON, we only have a few things installed, specifically React, React DOM, and then React scripts. So this is all that you get out of the box with a React create React application. React at its core is just a component library. It's just for creating components. When we get into state management, routing, and all that stuff, usually you have to pull in additional stuff, additional npm packages. But out of the box, what we can do is we can create components and we can render them on the page, and that's what we're going to do here. So by default, create React app stores everything into the src directory. And what we're going to focus on is this, the app.js file. So when we actually start this app, if we go here and look at our README, we'll see it says npm start, or we can use yarn start. Actually, it looks like this should be updated because our console says yarn start, so that could be a good open source pull request if anyone's interested. But let's just do yarn start and see what it pulls up for us. So here is our boilerplate app.js file. So if we just hop back here and look at this, we can see edit src app.js, which is the file that we're in. So if we even delete this and say hi there, save that, when we come back, it will update. So that's, again, out of the box, we're going to get that live reload feature. So as soon as we make changes, we're going to see that within the browser itself. And the default CSS that we have is that animation, that app logo spin CSS. So I'm just going to pretty much delete all of this stuff because, frankly, I just don't want it. And we're going to leave it with this. Just div class name equals app. So now we just have a blank page. So how do we start actually using React, and what do we do to get something to show up on the page? Well, this is where components come in. And as you start working on lots of different React apps, you're going to see lots of different file structures, folder structures. We're going to keep it really simple, and we're just going to create a components directory here. And while I'm at it, let me make the text here a little bit bigger so it's just easier to read. So within the components directory, is where I'm just going to store my components. You can save these anywhere. There's really no opinionated way to do it. So let's start with, we'll just call it basic component React.js. And these are JavaScript files. So in the React ecosystem, there are two types of components. There are class components, which use JavaScript classes, and there are function components, which are just basic functions. Typically, what you'll see is you'll use class components if you need to manage some sort of state within that component. And it doesn't need to be long-lived state, it doesn't need to be, a user session or anything like that. Even just something as simple as toggling things on a page, that's considered state, right? And you would want a class to kind of manage that. Function components had traditionally just been for rendering content. If you had something that was static, or if you had something that maybe just took a couple properties, but we knew those properties weren't going to change and we just wanted to render them on the page, that's what function components were for. They were much more lightweight, but they couldn't do things like updating stuff on the page. That is changing with hooks. I guess the new buzzword within React. I can go into hooks in another video, but for right now, I'm going to go with kind of what we've been seeing in the JavaScript community for the past several years. So the first thing you do is you import React and the component class from React. So we're going to build a class here, and we called it basic component, and that extends component. So here is our class, and at the end we're going to export that out. So what goes into a React component? The most important thing is the render hook. So no matter what, you're always going to need a render hook. This is what we render what is on the page. And a render hook returns JSX. So JSX is the rendering engine, and it looks a lot like HTML. In fact, let's just write some really quick here. We will return. So you always have to use parens here when you're returning JSX. And I usually break it out into multiple lines. And let's maybe just create a div. And we'll just do an H1 here. Say basic component. Now the thing to remember with JSX when we're returning it is you always need a wrapping element. And by that I mean I couldn't do this. H2 something. You'll see it's even not highlighting this because it knows that that syntax is wrong. You cannot have siblings at the highest level of your JSX implementation. There are ways to get around this, but traditionally you're always going to want a wrapping element. In fact, you're always going to be required to have a wrapping element within your component. So how do we show this on the page? Well, we can just go right here and we can import that component that we just created. So import basic component from components basic component. And then we'll just throw that right onto the page. And again, this is JSX, and this is how we would write this. We always have the closing slash within this component, and it should, again, update our page, and we see here is our basic component, that H1 that we created. And just to kind of show that, again, live updating, and it updates it there. So that is very, very simple. How do we create a component and how do we get it on the page? Now, the nice thing with components is that you can pass things to them. They are essentially functions that take parameters and then they return something out. In this case, they're returning JSX that we render on the page. So how do we get stuff from one component to another? You literally just pass it like this. We could say fruit equals apple. So we're now passing something to this component, but what do I do with it? How do I actually access that within the component itself? So let's maybe add a paragraph tag here. Oops, lowercase p. And we could say the fruit is. Then if I want to render dynamic content within JSX, you use curly braces. So in Angular and Ember, you've probably seen double curly braces, or I should say HTML bars or handlebars. In JSX, it's just single. And what this allows us to do is write raw JavaScript right here. It's super handy because you can actually just write functions. You can write console.log, hi there. And if I bring my console over here, you can see it's rendering hi there in my console. So that's one of the things I really, really like about JSX, is that I can just write JavaScript right there. It's super handy if you're debugging something, or if you just want to see if the code actually gets that far. It's really easy to just implement that stuff right within the template. But we want to render that fruit, right, that we're passing in from app.js. And when we pass something in like this, it is attached to an object called props. So because we're within a class, we want to refer to this, referring to our basic component, .props.fruit. The fruit is apple. Sorry if I'm switching too fast there, but just to show, if I come here and I switch this fruit to melon, so now we're passing in melon, and we go back to our browser, the fruit is melon. So by default, components within React are not aware of the components around them. So this basic component is not aware of the app.js file. It's only aware of what we pass to it. So in order for us to get something like the user information, or additional context from like an AJAX request, we have to pass it into that component. It's not going to know what to do otherwise. So we've passed this in, but let's say in this component, I want a way to update that fruit, right? I want to click a button and I want to change it to apple if it's a melon, or change it to melon if it's an apple. So how do we do that? Well, let's first add a button. So here's our button. It doesn't do anything yet. We'll keep clicking it, but again, nothing quite yet. So within a JSX, just like with an HTML, we can create on-click events. However, in HTML, you would normally write it like this, some function, and it would look through all of your script file and find a function called some function that was globally available, and it would call it. In JSX, it doesn't work that way. In JSX, we have to pass it an actual function. So let's write one within our component here. And we're going to call it change the fruit. And let's just add a console.log here just to see if we can actually get there. Has this been called? Question mark. And we will call this dot change the fruit. So what you'll see happen is it is in fact called immediately, right? But it's not called again when I keep clicking it. And that's because the way that JSX searches through this, it's actually seeing this as JavaScript and it's executing it, right? It hasn't actually bound it to this. So if I change that to this, right, this is what it should be. On click is a reference to this method. You can see it is called there. So let's maybe console log this.props.fruit and see what we get. Refresh the page. We get an error. Can't read props of undefined. So this is something that trips up a lot of people at first, and this just has to do with function scoping. When we are within this, right, we are scoped within the context of the function. It isn't aware of this dot props. So what you'll often see is people will write arrow functions that return this method. So an arrow function is going to keep the lexical scope of the object in which that's calling it. And if you aren't familiar with function scoping, I can link to something in the description. But from the JavaScript perspective, when you call something within a function, this refers to the function. It doesn't refer to the outer class. You can keep that though by writing arrow functions and saying we're going to call this bound to the context of this parent object. So now if I go and I click this, you can see I get melon. Cool. So if we can access this .props here now, your first thought might be, oh, I'll just do this .props .fruit equals apple. So refresh the page, and it blows up. So why? Oops, nope, because I missed an S, because that was actually the wrong error. So this is what I wanted to see. Cannot assign a read-only property of fruit. Props are immutable. Props are, in fact, read-only. So we can pass props in, we can render them on the page, but we cannot mutate them. Now the reason for this is you typically don't want your children mutating the state of their parents, right? If you did, what you would typically do is pass in a function to this component and have this component call that function. That function kind of bubbles up, right, and updates the state on the parent. So this is maybe a little more complex than I need to get into, but you know, in Ember they have this concept of data down, actions up, and the idea is that whatever thing invokes a model. So if our app.js maybe requested the user, it should be in charge of mutating that user, and it should provide the API for mutating that user. And it can pass that API down, it can pass those functions down, but ultimately all that logic's going to live in that one spot. But we want to be able to update this fruit within this component. So how do we do that? In order to do that, we have to use what's called this.state. So this.state is what can be mutated very easily within a component, and also when we update the state, there are ways to tell it to re-render the component to essentially flag that we do in fact have a change and we want to update what's showing up on the page. But in order to do that, we need to set kind of the initial state, and we'll do that in our constructor function. Constructor. They take the props by default. So we'll call it this.super.props. Now you don't always need this, but essentially what it does is it makes sure that if we're extending from, let's say, another component, so you could have created a base component or something like that, this will then make sure that we're still calling the constructor function on that parent component, right? But then we're going to go and add extra code here, but we're making sure that we're not breaking that kind of inheritance. So here we're going to set this.state, and that's just a simple hash. And that hash is going to be fruit. And we're going to set that to this.props.fruit. Pretty simple, again. So now we need to go and make sure we render this on the page. So let's make sure that this is in fact correct. It says melon, right? So we're no longer rendering props. Now we're rendering state. So again, your thought might be, oh, awesome. I'm just going to do this.state.fruit equals apple, and it's going to change for me. But again, it doesn't. And let's change this to state and see if what we're logging here is actually mutated. So we click it once, it says melon, but we click it again and it says apple. However, it's still saying melon here. So what's up with that? That's because we haven't told the component to re-render. It's not aware that a change has happened, so it hasn't rehydrated this. And that is where this.setState comes in. So setState takes a hash that is supposed to represent state or part of the state. Now here we only have one thing, so we're just going to say this.fruit equals apple. And let's just go ahead and delete this line. And if we save this, you can see it is now rehydrated and it updates. And one of the really nice things about this, let me expand this and we'll refresh here. So you can see it says melon, and watch for what it highlights when I click this button. See how only that updated? That's one of the really nice things about the shadow DOM, is it's only going to update the things in the DOM that have actually changed. It's not re-rendering the entire component like some other JavaScript frameworks have been doing. So what does this .set state actually do for us? Now you might think, oh, I'd have to pass the entire state to this function. So let's say we had another thing like name is Bob, right? And let's just console log this .bob. Go back to our console here. Bob is there, and if I keep clicking it, Bob is still there. So this .state doesn't override state. What it essentially does is what's called like a merge or object.assign the new state and the old state. So it's going to merge those two together with the new state winning out. So it'll look through old state and say, okay, fruit is here. I'm going to update the old state. So fruit is now apple, but you didn't pass in name anything, right? So I'm going to keep the old name that I have, right? You're not overwriting state. You're just passing the keys that you know, and they're going to update for you. One of the things that really kind of confused me is what if there's an instance where I can't necessarily call this .set state, or if I'm doing something really complex with some third-party library, is there a way I can just tell the component to re-render? So let's go back, whoops, to comment this out. So let's go back to this implementation, this .state .fruit equals melon, or sorry, apple. Then if I want to say, you know, I've updated this state, I didn't use set state, so it triggered that stuff for me, but I want to force this to update. I'm going to call this .force update. So let's go through and I click again, and there it is. It's updated to apple. So you can force your component to re-render if you know that a change exists. However, force update always calls the render hook again, and that can be somewhat inefficient. So let's say, for instance, no change actually happened. I just have this function and it just calls this .force update. And I'm going to add a log here just so we can see how many times this is run. We'll say that we are rendering, and I'll go through and I'll just click this, and every single time I click this button, it's actually re-rendering this component or calling the render hook. Again, it's not rehydrating, but the render hook does have some overhead. So try to always use this .set state, because what it will look for is actual changes in that state object, and if it doesn't see any, then it's not going to go through all this rendering lifecycle. If that's not the case for you, if you have to use this .force update, just be aware that it can be really inefficient. So you might want to add some sort of checking to make sure that changes actually did happen. Otherwise, you might be re-rendering, you know, your entire app if there's lots of different components within there. Now, components themselves have a few out-of-the-box methods that we can use. These are part of the component lifecycle. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this component and create a new one. And we're going to call this rectangle. We'll just call it rectangle. And let's just kind of delete this stuff that we have right here. All right, cool. So one of the most common ones that you're going to see is a function called component did mount. So what does this mean? This means it's a function that is called once the component is actually showing up on the page, once it's actually in the DOM and we can access those DOM elements. So you might be thinking, like, when does this actually come in handy? Because I can add the event listeners on the DOM elements themselves. For things like canvases, like drawing on the page, like calculating the height of an element, for instance, you won't know that thing necessarily until it's actually on the page, and we have to take the person's browser into perspective. So as a quick example, let's work with a canvas. We'll give it an ID of, we'll say my canvas. And I think you can add boilerplate, says your browser doesn't support this. And we'll give it a static width of just like 200 pixels and a height of 100. Cool. So if you've ever worked with canvases before, you know like maybe the most basic implementation where we say that canvas document dot query selector my canvas, right? And sorry, this is supposed to be within here. Then you get the context of that. So that's usually referred to as CTX in most of the documentation you'll see, and it's canvas dot get context. And this isn't meant to be a canvas overview. You can certainly look into this. Definitely not an expert here, but let's just fill the style here with red and CTX dot fill rect, and we'll create a rectangle 150 and 75. Oh, and now we need to actually add this to the page. So let's do this. We'll call it rectangle, and then, oops, I missed an L up here. I missed an L there too, apparently. All right, so we go here and bam, we have our rectangle. So if this, let's say this lived in that constructor, and we'll always call super to make sure that this calls anything it inherits. Doesn't work, right? Because again, constructor is called immediately as soon as we are creating that class object, that instance of that component. You know, canvas doesn't exist on the page yet. That's why we go with component did mount. That tells us safely, hey, we've rendered something on the page. I know it's there. You can start writing your logic that has to do with that. So one of the other things that you'll see sometimes within components is something like this, / basic component. And I'll get rid of this trailing slash, and that's a wrapping component. So if I go back to this page, you'll see our red box doesn't appear here anymore. And that's because our basic component encompasses this child component. But within here, we have to specify where that actually gets rendered within this DOM tree. And this is kind of nice because it allows us to create things like modal components, for instance, but then we can dynamically add whatever content to that modal we want within here. But then this basic component contains all the logic related to displaying it on the page, you know, graying out the background, adding a close button, right? The basic modal implementations, but then the HTML content can be shown here. But within this, we have to specify, okay, where are we actually going to render that? And we do that this way. Again, curly braces to write JavaScript. This dot props, dot children. And there's our rectangle. Why is it above the button? No, it's below the button. There's something going on with my CSS, but you know what? That's fine. But the point is we can kind of put this anywhere. We could have put it up here if we wanted to, and it'll move it up in the DOM tree. So it's specifying where within this we're going to render the child output, the thing that is rendered within this. And that can be any number of components or just DOM nodes. So this wrapping component inherently gets children as a prop passed to it. I wouldn't play around with mutating the children because that's just going to break your app. But just know, again, it's a really easy way for us to kind of do this really simple implementation of a wrapping element, again, like a modal or a chat box or something, but then we can make the content within it dynamic. So that's component did mount. Again, wait for the component to show up on the page so that I can play around with the DOM element. There's also component will unmount, and this is called before the component's destroyed. So this is typically for removing event listeners. So you might wait for the component to mount to add an event listener. You might do that typically if you are trying to listen to an event outside of the scope of the component that you're in. Like maybe I need to mutate something here if the user focuses out of another field. So in that instance, I'm adding an event listener to something that isn't going to be removed from the DOM when this component's destroyed. In that case, I want to make sure I remove that event listener, right, when this component is destroyed, because I'm no longer dependent on it. So this is again kind of for your code cleanup. There are a few deprecated ones that you'll see, and I just want to go over them just because you might end up working on an older React app that hasn't updated to the latest version. One of them is component did update. So something in our state updated is going to be rendering. So this is again something I can call after we've re-rendered that page. Another one is should component update. And again, I believe this one is deprecated. But again, this returns, ultimately it needs to return true or false. And if it returns true, the component will re-render. If it returns false, the component won't. So you might maybe sometimes need to get in there and really control that logic for when you actually want something to update. There might be a time where state updates and you don't want it to re-render. This would be that instance where you want to catch that and not re-render your component. The last one is called get snap lowercase snapshot before update, and that takes two things. It takes the previous props and the previous state. So it takes the state instance before we have updated, and then it really returns anything that we want it to return. And this snapshot is what gets passed to component did update. So component did update takes previous props as well, then previous state, then a snapshot. And the snapshot again can be anything, but in this instance I need to pass some additional context to this update function so that it can call something appropriately. This would be an instance of like I need to derive something from the DOM, like the height of an element that just isn't apparent from the state itself. This is kind of that intermediate step that allows me to look at both the previous state and the current state and update something appropriately, and maybe pass just like a height or a really simple value along to that update method. So again, most of the components that you're going to see use component did mount, component will unmount. Those are the most common ones. These you're rarely ever going to see, and that's really when you're starting to get into the nitty-gritty edge case stuff, and a lot of these are deprecated anyway. But I just kind of wanted to show them because you might be jumping into some older React projects where they were a lot more prevalent, and it's good to just kind of understand basically what the context is there. Hopefully that wasn't too much information. So the last thing I want to go over is function components. So I'm going to create a new one here called, we'll just call it simple component.js. And here we still have to import React. We always have to import React, but this time we are not importing component, the component class. And we're going to export a default function called simple component. And just like the render function, it's going to return JSX. We're going to get that wrapping element, and that can be anything, doesn't have to be a div. And we'll just say, paragraph, this is my simple component. So now within this app.js file, I'm going to import simple component from simple component. And we're going to put that right here on the page. And here we go. This is my simple component. So again, typically function components were meant for really basic content. However, they can take properties as well. So for instance, let's say we have first name equals Billy and last name equals Bobby. How do we get this stuff to show up like we got the fruit to show up within that component? All props are passed as a hash to this function. So we could still call this props here, right? And then we could say, you know, let first name equals props.firstname, and let last name equals props.lastname. And then we'll actually write this here. Hi there, first name, last name. Hi there, Billy. Did I write that incorrectly? Last name with a T. Hi there, Billy Bobby. And of course, if you're familiar with ES5 syntax, we can destructure this to last name like that from props. Does the same thing, but what you'll see most people do is do that destructuring within the function call, because again, component or a function component is always going to take just one parameter, and that's going to be a hash. If you just have, you know, I'd say 1, 2, or 3 attributes within that hash, destructure it here. Otherwise, I'd say do that thing where you write out the props and then maybe set the variables here, just because this stuff eventually just becomes too long and it just becomes more confusing. But you'll see this works just fine with destructuring there. So that's kind of React components out of the box for the basic implementations of a class component specifically, but also a function component. So again, you can control state within function components now, thanks to React hooks and useState. I'm going to cover that in another video. But that is something that is, I believe, only in React scripts like 16.5 and later, maybe even later than that. It is fairly recent, and you'll see a lot of people that say, oh, you should rewrite all of your components to use this when you can. But the reality for a lot of us is, you know, we join companies and, you know, doing a big rewrite just isn't realistic. You're adopting a legacy app, so you're going to see a lot of stuff like this. You're, you know, class components that that could be converted, but just wasn't available yet. And I'd say even with React hooks, I find that logic like this, where I have to wait for the thing to be rendered first, I still like the class components more because of the component did mount hooks. In function components, you end up having to write logic to say, okay, does this exist? No. Just do an early return. And then once it's rendered, it will actually rerun this function, and then it'll go and it'll pass that. So you end up just kind of writing that if-else logic anyway. I think this just kind of reads a little bit cleaner. And, you know, classes are also nice because you can extend, you can create parent components and kind of share logic very easily among things. It's not as easy with function components. So I don't think class components are ever going to go away, because there's just going to be times where you want, you know, a class and you can encapsulate a lot of logic into a class. So don't think that you're going to have to rewrite your app to 100% use React hooks. I did that with one app, and, you know, ultimately it doesn't look quite as clean, I think, as some people make it out to look. But for so many instances, yes, it does clean up a lot of this. So hopefully you found this useful. Again, this is my first React tutorial, so sorry if I went on a little too long about some stuff, but just wanted to show that, you know, out of the box, you can get something running really quickly with Create React App. That's pretty straightforward once you kind of understand the syntax and how to structure things. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment.